Imagine this. You wake up one morning and discover that the pain which once defined your life no longer asks for your attention. The voices that demanded your forgiveness have grown strangely quiet. The people who once fed upon your compassion now seem distant, almost unreal, as though they belonged to someone else's story. Nothing around you has changed, and yet everything has. This is the moment few people recognize. They call it healing. Carl Jung might have called it the beginning of individuation. But for the empath, it is something even more unsettling. It is the moment the old self quietly dies. The world often misunderstands the empath. It imagines someone endlessly kind, endlessly patient, endlessly available, someone who absorbs the suffering of others because love requires sacrifice. Society praises this version because it is useful. Families depend on it, narcissists exploit it, friends lean against it, lovers mistake it for unconditional devotion. But Jung warned that every virtue casts a shadow. Kindness without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Compassion without consciousness becomes unconscious servitude. The empath who cannot say no eventually forgets there was ever a self capable of saying yes to life. This is why awakening rarely feels beautiful in the beginning. It begins as disappointment. The disappointment that follows years of giving without receiving. The disappointment of realizing that being needed is not the same as being loved. The disappointment of recognizing that countless relationships were built not upon mutual respect, but upon unconscious contracts. One person provided endless emotional labor while another consumed it without gratitude. Many women experience this revelation not because life suddenly becomes cruel, but because the unconscious finally becomes visible. Jung believed that consciousness expands through suffering that is understood. Pain itself does not transform. Understanding does. The empath begins noticing strange patterns. Why do certain people always appear during moments of strength, but disappear during moments of weakness? Why do apologies always arrive only after distance has been created? Why does generosity attract entitlement instead of appreciation? These questions become doorways. Not toward bitterness, toward truth. And truth is rarely comfortable. The awakened empath gradually discovers something that terrifies the ego. Many relationships survived only because one person remained asleep. As long as she ignored her exhaustion, everyone remained comfortable. As long as she carried everyone's emotional burdens, peace appeared to exist. As long as she believed fixing others gave her purpose, nobody questioned the arrangement. But consciousness changes every equation. The moment she begins asking, "What do I actually need?" the entire emotional ecosystem begins collapsing. People who claim to love her accuse her of changing. They say she has become cold, selfish, distant, different. Yet what they truly mourn is not her transformation. They mourn the disappearance of unlimited access. Marcus Aurelius once observed that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The empath once colored her soul with everyone else's emotions. Fear became her fear. Anxiety became her anxiety. Shame became her shame. She mistook emotional absorption for intimacy. She confused suffering together with genuine connection. But awakening separates what belongs to the self from what belongs to others. This separation feels almost violent. Not because love disappears. Because illusion does. Something remarkable begins happening inside her nervous system. She no longer rushes to solve every conflict. Silence no longer frightens her. Another person's disappointment no longer feels like evidence of personal failure. She watches emotional storms without believing she must become the weather itself. This is not emotional detachment. It is psychological differentiation. Jung described individuation as becoming who one truly is rather than who others expect. For the empath, this process often appears heartless to those who benefited from her self-erasure. Yet inwardly, something sacred is emerging. The forgotten self. There exists within every woman an unconscious figure who has waited patiently beneath years of people-pleasing. She carries untapped anger, unspoken truth, hidden creativity, wild intuition, ancient wisdom. For years this woman remained imprisoned beneath the persona, the socially acceptable mask designed to earn approval. The empath smiled while secretly grieving. She comforted others while privately collapsing. She apologized for emotions she never caused. Eventually, the shadow refused to remain silent. Not because darkness desired destruction. Because authenticity demanded birth. Many fear the shadow because they imagine it contains only rage. Jung insisted otherwise. The shadow also contains abandoned strength. Every boundary never spoken. Every dream postponed. Every instinct dismissed. Every courageous word swallowed to preserve another person's comfort. When awakening begins, these forgotten fragments return. They do not ask politely. They arrive like earthquakes beneath carefully constructed identities. The empath suddenly hears herself saying no. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Simply truthfully. To everyone else, this seems shocking. To her own soul, it feels like finally breathing after years beneath water. Something fascinating happens in relationships during this stage. Those who truly love her begin adapting. Those who loved only her usefulness begin resisting. The difference becomes impossible to ignore. Awakening functions like light entering an abandoned house. Dust becomes visible. Broken foundations appear. Hidden insects scatter. The light did not create the decay. It merely revealed what darkness concealed. Likewise, spiritual awakening exposes unconscious dynamics already present. Trauma often teaches empaths that love must be earned. Children raised amid emotional unpredictability become extraordinary observers. They detect microscopic shifts in facial expressions. Subtle changes in tone. Invisible emotional currents. This ability once protected them. As adults, however, survival mechanisms disguise themselves as personality. Hypervigilance becomes empathy. Self-neglect becomes generosity. Emotional overfunctioning becomes love. Modern psychology recognizes this as trauma adaptation. Jung understood it as unconscious identification. The personality clings to familiar suffering because it mistakes familiarity for safety. Awakening interrupts this cycle. Suddenly, peace feels unfamiliar. Healthy relationships feel suspicious. Calm feels boring. The nervous system initially longs for chaos because chaos once resembled home. This is where true courage begins. Not in confronting others, but in remaining faithful to peace even when every conditioned instinct urges a return to emotional warfare. Seneca reminded humanity that the greatest slavery is living according to external circumstances. The awakened empath slowly refuses this slavery. She discovers that her emotional state no longer depends upon someone else's approval. This realization appears almost supernatural to people accustomed to controlling her through guilt. The old manipulations lose power. Silent treatment no longer creates panic. Criticism no longer destroys identity. Withdrawal no longer triggers desperate pursuit. Because something greater has quietly awakened. Self-respect. Not the loud, performative confidence celebrated by social media, but the silent certainty that one's soul deserves honesty more than acceptance. This certainty cannot be borrowed. It cannot be taught. It must be discovered within the ruins of every false identity that finally collapses. And once that discovery begins, there is no returning to the woman who confused endless sacrifice with unconditional love. The transformation does not announce itself with celebration. It arrives through absence. One day she notices that she is no longer exhausted after every conversation. She no longer spends sleepless nights replaying someone else's words, searching for hidden meanings or inventing ways to repair emotions that were never hers to carry. The silence that once felt unbearable now feels strangely comforting. It is no longer empty. It is spacious. To the outside world, nothing extraordinary has happened. She still smiles. She still offers kindness. She still listens with compassion. Yet beneath those familiar gestures, an entirely different psychological architecture has emerged. Compassion is no longer rooted in fear. It is rooted in choice. This distinction changes everything. Before awakening, the empath believed every emotional wound she witnessed demanded her intervention. Another person's sadness became her responsibility. Another person's anger became a puzzle she desperately tried to solve. If someone withdrew, she questioned her own worth. If someone suffered, she instinctively sacrificed herself. But awakening introduces a truth the ego desperately resists. Not every pain belongs to you. Carl Jung often described projection as one of humanity's greatest unconscious forces. People rarely see others as they truly are. Instead, they encounter fragments of themselves reflected outward. The empath slowly realizes she has spent years carrying projections that were never hers. She was called too sensitive by people terrified of their own emotions. She was labeled difficult by those who depended upon her silence. She was accused of changing by people unwilling to grow. Every accusation became another invisible weight. Every misunderstanding became another burden upon a heart already overloaded with responsibility. Yet something remarkable begins happening after spiritual awakening. Instead of defending herself, she becomes curious. Instead of asking, "Why do they think this about me?" she begins asking, "What inside them needs me to believe this?" This single shift changes the entire emotional landscape. Because projection loses its power once it is recognized. Imagine standing before a mirror covered in dust. For years you believed the stains belonged to your own face. Only later do you discover the glass itself was dirty. Nothing about you needed fixing. Only your perspective required cleansing. This is what awakening feels like. Reality itself becomes clearer. Not because people suddenly become kinder, but because illusion becomes impossible to maintain. Many women fear becoming emotionally detached during this stage. They worry they're losing their ability to love. In truth, they're losing their addiction to rescuing. There is a profound difference. Love honors freedom. Rescuing unconsciously controls. Love invites growth. Rescuing often prevents it. The awakened empath no longer interferes with every struggle. She understands that some lessons belong to experience rather than explanation. Some wounds heal only after consequences have spoken. Some souls awaken only after comfort disappears. This wisdom appears almost paradoxical. She becomes more compassionate than ever before. Yet she intervenes far less. Because genuine compassion respects another person's journey. It does not steal it. Epictetus taught that suffering often begins when people attempt to control what was never theirs. The empath finally understands this at the deepest psychological level. She cannot control another person's honesty. She cannot manufacture emotional maturity. She cannot force accountability. She cannot awaken someone who is committed to sleeping. The only consciousness she truly governs is her own. This realization feels both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removes the illusion of control. Liberating because it removes the impossible burden of saving everyone. There comes a moment when she notices something almost unbelievable. The people who once consumed all her energy no longer occupy her thoughts. Not because she hates them. Hatred still binds two souls together. No. She simply stops orbiting around them. Their opinions become weather passing across an enormous sky. Their judgments lose permanence. Their approval loses value. Their rejection loses authority. The center of gravity has shifted. It no longer exists outside herself. Psychologically, this marks one of the greatest milestones of individuation. The ego once organized itself around external validation. Now the self quietly takes its rightful place. Jung distinguished between the ego and the self in ways many misunderstand. The ego asks, "Who must I become so others will accept me?" The self asks, "Who have I always been beneath every mask?" These questions lead toward entirely different lives. One creates performance. The other creates authenticity. One depends upon applause. The other survives in silence. The awakened empath gradually stops performing goodness. Instead, she becomes genuinely good. The difference is subtle. Performance seeks recognition. Authenticity seeks alignment. Performance fears criticism. Authenticity welcomes truth. Performance constantly scans the room. Authenticity remains present within itself. People begin responding differently. Some drift away without explanation. Others become unexpectedly hostile. A few suddenly return with dramatic apologies. All of these reactions reveal something fascinating. Transformation forces every relationship to reveal its foundation. Those built upon mutual respect deepen. Those built upon dependency collapse. Those built upon manipulation become desperate. You may have experienced this without understanding why. Someone who ignored your needs for years suddenly demands your attention. Someone who rarely contacted you now insists they miss you. Someone who dismissed your feelings suddenly becomes emotional. At first glance, this appears like love. But awakening teaches discernment. Need is not always love. Possession is not always devotion. Fear of losing access is not the same as appreciation. The empath develops an entirely new emotional language. She no longer interprets words in isolation. She observes patterns, consistency, behavior, energy, integrity. This quiet observation replaces emotional urgency. She does not rush toward promises. She watches whether actions naturally follow. This patience unsettles manipulative personalities. Control depends upon immediate emotional reactions. Awareness creates space. Within that space, freedom appears. Trauma once taught her to respond instantly. Healthy consciousness teaches her to pause. And within every pause exists choice. Neuroscience increasingly confirms what ancient philosophers intuitively understood. When human beings repeatedly react from fear, the nervous system reinforces survival pathways. Over time, automatic reactions replace conscious decisions. Awakening interrupts these unconscious loops. The empath notices her body before her mind. She recognizes tension in her shoulders, tightness in her chest, the subtle urge to apologize unnecessarily, the impulse to over-explain. These bodily sensations become messengers rather than commands. Instead of obeying them automatically, she listens. What are you trying to protect? Often the answer reaches far into childhood. The little girl who believed love disappeared after mistakes. The teenager who learned peace depended upon pleasing everyone. The young woman who confused self-sacrifice with emotional security. Rather than rejecting these earlier versions of herself, she embraces them. This is true shadow work. Not destroying old identities. Integrating them. The frightened child is no longer left alone inside the unconscious. She is welcomed into awareness. She is comforted rather than silenced. She is understood rather than judged. This integration creates extraordinary strength. Because fragmented people seek completion through others. Integrated people share themselves without disappearing. The awakened empath no longer searches for someone to rescue her from loneliness. She discovers solitude has become a sanctuary rather than a prison. There, beneath the noise of expectation, she encounters something she has not heard in years. Her own inner voice. It does not shout. It whispers. And unlike the voices that demanded endless sacrifice, this one asks for only one thing. Truth. Truth has a peculiar way of rearranging an entire life without making a sound. The awakened empath begins noticing that the greatest changes are almost invisible. There is no dramatic announcement, no public declaration, no need to convince anyone that transformation has occurred. The deepest revolutions happen quietly, beneath the surface, where the unconscious slowly surrenders its oldest fears. She walks through familiar places, yet they no longer feel the same. She sits across from familiar faces, yet the conversations seem strangely different. Not because the world has changed. Because she no longer participates in the same psychological dance. There was a time when every interaction carried an invisible question. What must I do to be enough? The question hid behind generosity. It disguised itself as patience. It appeared as forgiveness offered too quickly, understanding given too freely, and second chances extended without wisdom. Now another question quietly replaces it. What is true? This question is dangerous. It dismantles illusions without mercy. It asks whether love exists without respect. It asks whether loyalty survives without honesty. It asks whether peace purchased through self-betrayal was ever peace at all. Few people welcome these questions, because they expose the architecture of every relationship. Carl Jung believed that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it directs life while convincing people that fate is responsible. The empath begins recognizing that many of her choices were never truly choices. They were unconscious repetitions. She trusted familiar personalities because they resembled unresolved wounds. She felt strangely drawn toward emotionally unavailable people because uncertainty had once felt like love. She mistook emotional intensity for emotional intimacy. The soul repeatedly sought what the nervous system recognized, even when recognition led back to suffering. This realization is painful, not because she blames herself, but because she understands how deeply unconscious patterns can shape an entire lifetime. Awakening is not discovering perfection. It is discovering awareness. Awareness changes everything. Imagine standing beside a river you have crossed every day for years. One morning, the water becomes so clear that you can finally see the current beneath the surface. Suddenly, you understand why you always struggled to cross at the same place. The current had been pulling against you all along. Nothing about the river changed. Only your ability to see it. So it is with the unconscious. The empath begins recognizing emotional currents before stepping into them. She notices excessive charm without substance. She notices promises unsupported by action. She notices guilt disguised as affection. She notices flattery designed to create obligation. These patterns no longer fascinate her. They simply reveal themselves. Discernment replaces idealization. This is one of the greatest gifts of spiritual awakening. Not the ability to see goodness everywhere. The ability to see reality without needing it to become fantasy. Many people believe awakening makes someone softer. In truth, it often makes them clearer. Clarity can appear intimidating to those who rely upon confusion. Those accustomed to emotional manipulation become uncomfortable around someone who no longer explains herself endlessly. Those who once controlled through guilt discover that guilt requires participation. Without participation, manipulation collapses. There is something profoundly unsettling about a woman who no longer needs to prove her goodness. She does not rush to defend her character. She does not chase misunderstandings. She allows truth to mature in its own time. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like the one who caused harm. The awakened empath understands this instinctively. She no longer seeks revenge because revenge still grants the past authority over the present. Instead, she chooses something infinitely more powerful. Indifference born from healing. Not coldness. Not bitterness. Simply freedom. There is an enormous psychological difference between suppressing emotion and transcending it. Suppression buries pain beneath the surface, where it quietly shapes behavior. Transcendence allows pain to complete its purpose before gently releasing it. The awakened empath does not pretend betrayal never happened. She remembers. But memory no longer dictates identity. The scars remain. The suffering no longer owns her. This is why spiritually awakened people often seem mysterious. Others cannot understand why old insults no longer provoke them. Why old temptations no longer attract them. Why familiar dramas receive only silence. They mistake peace for weakness. Yet silence born from consciousness is one of the strongest responses a human being can offer. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus reminded his students that no person has the power to disturb another without permission. For years the empath unknowingly handed out that permission. Every criticism became a wound. Every rejection became evidence. Every disappointment became self-condemnation. Now she quietly reclaims her authority. Not by controlling others. By governing herself. This inner governance changes the quality of her relationships. For the first time, she becomes capable of receiving love rather than merely giving it. This surprises her. Giving always felt safer. Giving created purpose. Giving earned acceptance. Receiving required vulnerability. Receiving required believing she possessed value before proving it. This is one of awakening's final lessons. Worth cannot be achieved through performance. It must be recognized as inherent. The woman who understands this stops negotiating with people who continuously ask her to diminish herself. She no longer apologizes for healthy boundaries. She no longer confuses loneliness with failure. She no longer believes that being chosen by everyone is evidence of a meaningful life. Instead, she becomes extraordinarily selective. Not because her heart has closed. Because it has finally learned its own value. You begin noticing this transformation in unexpected moments. You no longer explain your decisions to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop carrying conversations after the other person has already stopped investing. You allow people to experience the consequences of their own choices instead of rescuing them from every discomfort. Most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself whenever someone threatens to leave. This is not arrogance. It is integration. Jung believed the goal of life was not perfection but wholeness. Wholeness includes compassion without self-destruction, strength without cruelty, love without dependency, forgiveness without forgetting wisdom. The awakened empath becomes something the world rarely expects. Not someone who feels less. Someone who finally feels without drowning. She enters relationships with an open heart but rooted feet. She offers kindness without surrendering discernment. She loves deeply without disappearing inside another person's story. And in that quiet balance, she discovers the paradox that had escaped her for so many years. The deepest expression of empathy is not sacrificing yourself to heal everyone you meet. It is becoming so fully yourself that your very presence gives others permission to become fully themselves as well. A woman who knows her worth does not pursue, she chooses.